Yeah, that's a good one. I forgot to record it because I had a problem earlier when I was trying to join. So when I tried rejoining, I didn't record it. Sorry, but it should start recording by now. Okay.
Yeah, it's recording now. Thank you.
So we have this side of the argument, right? So this side of the argument, what we tend to see here is that the death rate is higher than the birth rate. So the population tends to, we have a lower rate here. And here, the birth rate is higher than the death rate. So we have a higher rate somewhere here. So let's take an example and see how the Malthusian argument plays out. So let's take the situation where we have Z to increase. When Z increases, this guy increases. And as this guy increases, output increases. So we are moving from Y equals 1 to Y equals 2, where Z has now increased. So it means we have a new standard of living. And with new standard of living, what we tend to see is here. We find ourselves here. That is, the birth rate is higher than the death rate. And what will be the implication if the birth rate is higher than the death rate? What happens to N? Anyone in the chat room? What happens to N?
They say N increases.
Exactly, N increases. And as N increases, what happens to the standard of living? Remember, standard of living happens to be Z L over N. As N increases, what happens to the standard of living?
It decreases.
It decreases, right? So it goes back to where it happens to be. So that's the whole idea behind the Malthusian. So efficiency wouldn't increase our standard of living forever. There will be a point in time where we have to come back to where we were, which is this Y1. So regardless of what happens to Z, we will have to return back to Y1. And that's what we saw on the final day of our discussion. So let me quickly refer you guys back to the final discussion that we had, trying to explain how this mechanism works. On the first diagram that we saw, I believe that should be on page 176. There were a couple of things that should happen. The first diagram is the one for consumption. And remember, consumption is the same as standard of living. So we had consumption to be fixed up until a point where we call that point big T. Nothing happened to it. And we also have a population rate up until the point T. Nothing happened to it. And that's what you see over there. Let's assume that this is where we find ourselves. So when Z increased, with an increase in Z, what we saw here was that the standard of living increased. So it will increase. The standard of living increases, and because standard of living increases, consumption will increase. So you see a jump here. But at the same time, there's something happening to the number of people we are giving birth to. Because consumption has increased and Y has increased, the number of kids we are going to give birth to will also start increasing. And as this guy increased, what we saw here was that because this guy is a function of N, it will start to reduce back to normal, coming back to where it was. And that's the transition that I'm trying to point out to. And this guy goes back to a very high rate, which is a new value of my N. And this is Y. See, this is N. This is a time where we experience the increase in Z. And this is the time where we saw the same increase in Z, but it will have different implication on Y and on N. And because of these two implications, we'll come back to where we were supposed to be. So that's the whole idea behind the Malthusian. Is there anyone in the chat room with any question?
Nope, not as of now.
Okay. If there are no questions, then we have to find a way to discuss why we think the Malthusian wouldn't be a very good indication of our standard of living, because when we take the data from 1850 down up until now, what we realize is that the standard of living that we keep on experiencing every year tends to increase. And this is based on the Industrial Revolution. And Industrial Revolution, what we saw there was that there are a couple of things that were coming into play. Efficiency was increasing, capital was increasing, things were coming out to help us increase our standard of living. So if Malthusian is saying that standard of living will forever remain constant because of increase in population size, we have to come up with counter examples, give him a couple of examples to tell him that what he's saying might be wrong or what he's saying might be right. The first thing we can point out to him is this guy, this N. Remember, his argument about the N is basically because there's increase in standard of living, N will have to increase. Someone might give him a counter example, and that's what we see in today's environment. Whenever we see an increase in standard of living, which is tantamount to seeing an increase in economic activity, it's not always true that people will tend to give birth to more kids. It's rather the opposite. In the 1800s or before Malthusian came in, for sure, economic activity will exclude people. But in today's world, because of the increase in economic activity, we see a lot of people in the labor force. We see women in the labor force. We see men in the labor force. We see people going for education and all that. This increase in standard of living, which is the same as increase in economic activity, has led women and men as well to increase their participation in the labor force. As women increase their participation in labor force because there's more opportunities in the economic world, what happens to the number of kids that women would decide to have? That's a question. Would they decide to have more kids, or would they concentrate on their labor participation or academic? Exactly. They would tend to have fewer kids, right? So technically, we are trying to use his own example to give him a counter argument. So this counter argument is, you are saying Y increases, which is tantamount to economic activity increasing. But women, by participating in the labor force, will also decide to have lesser kids, which means N will obviously go down instead of his prediction of N going up. So this is a counter example. So if you use this counter example to give to in terms of the Malthusian argument, then you tend to see a rather opposite example here. So if you're going to use this counter example, then at the point of Z increasing, what we tend to see here is that this guy wouldn't increase, but it will rather reduce. Now the question here is, as N reduces, what happens to the standard of living here? As N reduces, what happens to the standard of living? It increases, right? So when this guy, it wouldn't come back to normal. It will either go up, remain the same, but it wouldn't come back to where we initially predicted. So that would be the first counter argument that we can give to Malthusian. Is there anyone with any question in there? Anson?
Nope, no questions.
Okay. Good. So keep this in mind. And these are some of the examples that we all discuss in class, and you for sure see them in your exams or in your midterm or in your quizzes. So what's about, is there a question in there? You have a question?
Yes, there's a question. So someone said, can you repeat the standard of living part again?
So is it the first part of the standard of living or on the diagram? Because we had it on both ways. Where does he want me to start from?
Diagram.
Diagram. So standard of living, remember, y is the same as my standard of living. And y is the same as z as a function of L over n. So what you guys said here was that n is going to go down. And as n goes down, what happens to this guy? What happens to y? Anson, is there an answer in there? If n goes down, what happens to y?
There's no answers, but I'm thinking increases.
It increases, right? Because n is down. So when n is down, y goes up. So initially, z was up, this guy goes down, and this guy goes down. So there are two effects. The first effect is from z, which will increase your y. The second effect is from n, which will further increase your standard of living. So what I'm saying here is that instead of the decline that we predicted, we are not going to see this decline anymore. We're going to see an upward shift, same shift, but we wouldn't see a decline. Osama, did I answer your question?
Yep, he said yes.
Okay. Yeah, so there are double effects here. Instead of the initial effects where we see one going up and one coming down, when we go with our own new arguments, it's rather the opposite. Is there anyone with any question? So these are a couple of things that I was trying to draw your attention to. So as you prepare for your midterm, keep in mind what are the arguments and how do they play out. Now, the second part of his argument, as you might have realized, was that he constantly based his production function on the fact that we produce output using labor and land. And this is true when you are to live in the period 1700s or maybe 1800s. If, however, you are to live in the periods like the one that we have right now, or just after the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution, to produce anything, do we necessarily need land? Is there anyone with an answer in there? Or what are the additional factors that came in after 1800 that helped us to produce? Exactly. We need capital. So here, land was an important factor before. If land is no more important, as Ella and John pointed out, where we need capital, if I put capital here, the question here is capital always fixed or does capital change? It changes, right? So compared to land, that constantly remains fixed. Capital does not remain fixed. It's always changing over time. So with this new factor of production, we can give a counter example to what Malthusian pointed out. Is there any question in there?
So fixed in SR? What does that mean, Alex? Short run.
I have the same question. Like in a lot of short-term models, capital is fixed in the short run, and it's only variable in the long run. So what about short-run models? That's
a good question. So even with the Malthusian, right? Even with the Malthusian, remember we still have some short-run dynamics, right? Even in the Malthusian where we assume land to be fixed, we still have some short-run dynamics, and that's what we see in between we moving from the higher input back to the lower input. So for the land, the whole idea here is that land is fixed both in the short run and in the long run. And we'll for sure come to a point in time where we've exhausted all the land that we have in the long run as well. But with regards to the capital is not as fixed as land is. It's not as if we have limited amounts of capital where whenever we reach that limit, that's the end of it. So it might be short, it might be in the short run, it might be in the long run, but there's no bound to it. It's more flexible in that sense.
That makes sense.
I hope so. If it's not clear, please draw my attention. If I live in Canada and I would like to plant maybe 10 apples, and the entire acres in Canada can accommodate 10 apples, that's the end of me. As soon as I reach those 10 apples, I'll forever remain there. I cannot increase it. But if there is a new way of producing apples that does not depend on land, then I'm not limited. I can increase it whenever I want. So that's the whole idea between Malthusian in terms of having a fixed amount of land and the, what's the name? The new model, which is a Solow growth model, which wouldn't depend on land, which is more or less like fixed. Yeah, John has a question. Anson, can you read it?
So is land considered a part of capital in more modern growth models?
No, we actually forget about land. We don't really use land. Yeah, it's very archaic. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Is there a question in there? So these are the two approaches. First of all, give a counter example as to the participation rate, which will further reduce your N to counteract what Malthusian proposed. And secondly, give a counter example as to the factors of production. Instead of using land, which is more or less like fixed and is very bounded, capital isn't that much. So when you use both approaches, you can explain why we see an increase in standard of living over time. Instead of Malthusian's prediction that standard of living is forever going to be constant in the long run. So I'm gonna be, yeah, so it's about time. I'm gonna post the your quiz for today. The code is gonna be Thursday. I'm gonna post it right now. The code for your quiz is Thursday, all caps. That'll be the code for the quiz. So get yourself ready. Yeah, I posted it. Please let me know if you've seen it. If not, Anson, let me know if you guys have seen it. It's been posted now. You can see it under quizzes, or you can perhaps see it under the models. I believe so.
Yep, I can access the quiz.
Okay, good. It's gonna be, yeah, it's gonna be for 20 minutes. Please use your time carefully. Not too much explanation. One sentence should be fine. And I wish you guys the best. Are we there yet? I think we are done, right? So please submit your assignment and let's get ready to start the discussion. So you have a minute to submit. So make sure you submit, don't be late. There will be a deduction of 1 point after every minute of lateness. So please keep an eye on that. So time is up, guys. Let's get back to work. So from now, any answer that you give will attract 1 point off. So keep that in mind. Anson, are we back?
I'm back. So there's a question in the chat room though.
Yeah, what's it?
Or is it old? I'm not sure, but Jean said for 2A, are there multiple variables that can be affected, or is it just one?
I'm just looking at one. I think it's already gone. So just look at the one that you guys gave. Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah, he said okay.
Okay then. So again, any lateness will attract one minus mark for every additional minute, just for the sake of fairness and for those who submitted ahead of schedule. And I wouldn't relax that rule for now. So just keep an eye on that. Let's come back and Anson, do you mind writing attendance? Just type attendance and type your name first and write present, and the rest will follow.
Okay, but there's an extra question. So when should we submit the quiz? 10:20 or 10:25?
10:20 right now. Yeah. It's already gone past time. It's 20 minutes. So write your full name and write your right present here. So anytime past 10 to 10:21, we'll attract -1 mark for each minute. Just for the sake of fairness. Also, do you guys mind telling me how was the quiz and how was the time?
The quiz was fair, I guess. But just like the typing, maybe some people are, having a slow typing speeds.
So I try as much as possible to keep it to only one sentence for now. Just one sentence and off you go. One sentence, off you go. I hope you guys, yeah.
Yeah, it was fair. It's pretty okay.
Okay, then hopefully we'll keep it as that. And one thing I'm really particular about is the whole idea of cheating and all that. So the quizzes will be related to what we do in class, so that it will be practically impossible for someone to sit in for you, unless of course the person follows what we do in class when it comes to our lectures and all that. And secondly, if you look at the quiz, I try as much as possible to make it pretty much shuffled, such that whenever you answer one particular question, you can't go back and change it. This is to prevent collaboration between the students as much as possible. So as soon as you are done, you wouldn't be able to go back and get it rectified. If the time is okay, then I'll surely keep an eye on that and maybe we'll move from there. Yeah. And if you realize, in terms of the questions that I asked, I think everything has to come from class. So there was this question I asked about the utility function. So this is basically your first assignment. So those who paid attention to the assignment and understood what they did realized that the utility function was in terms of substitute, where diversification wasn't needed. Either you go in for all of one good, which is consumption, or you go in for all of the other good, which is leisure. So that's one part where I try as much as possible to introduce what you guys did in the assignment in a very intuitive manner. One of the questions I also asked was about, yeah, that was straightforward, how we derive the income expenditure identity. And I think I stress on that here as to why we set investment to 0 and net export to 0. So if you have to pay attention to that, that should be fairly straightforward as well. In terms of your third question, I believe it's happening to be COVID. And I think Alex also asked a question about it when I mentioned it in class. So that's basically what you guys saw again. The leisure parameter, what we think is going to be, is it going to increase or reduce, and how that affects labor supply and labor demand. In terms of the labor demand question, that's basically what you guys saw in your assignment question, where you introduce in taxes to the firm's production function, and it reduces the marginal product of workers. So that's basically trying to capture what we did in class and what we did in assignments and see how best we can combine them. So I'm happy that the time was okay, and I'm happy that you guys think it's fair, and we might proceed on that line moving forward. So you guys might want to take 5 minutes break, relax, and come back, and let's go on with the Solow growth model. So 5 minutes, I'll be back. We should be back by 10:33, and I'll take attendance at then. Is that okay with everyone? Okay. Okay, we should be back by now. Anson, are you there? Is there someone in the room?
Yep, I'm back.
Okay, so yeah, so if you want to go ahead with it, that's fine with me. I'll be happy for you to continue. But if someone wants to, help out, let me know. If in case you want to help out, if not, Anson, just feel free to continue with the duty if you so wish. So we have the Solow growth model to start with. And basically what we do have here is the setup for the Solow model. So for the Solow model, just like what I pointed out earlier, one important distinction is in terms of the output function. Instead of having capital, here we have, instead of having land, here we have capital. So that's one thing you have to keep in mind. So this is how we produce our outputs. We use capital and we use labor. And this is our output per worker. And this is going to be very, very important whenever we have smaller letters compared to bigger ones. So whenever you have big Y divided by the big N, you have a smaller representation of it. So either it is output per worker, or it might be capital per worker, or whatever variable that is being given to us. So this is an important factor that I would like to point out. So here, big Y divided by big N, we have small y. If it happens to be big K divided by big N, then we have small k, which is output per worker. So this, I think, should be fairly reasonable for us, given what we did in the Malthusian. Now we need to produce one step further to introduce a couple of ideas. The very first one here is a growth rate. So in economics, whenever you hear growth rate, the formula is to take the current value subtracted from the past value all over the past value, or the future value minus the current value all over the current value. That will give you the growth rate of anything. So this is a standard formula whenever you come across growth rates. So given the fact that we are interested in understanding how the population transition over time, then there is a need for us to also explain what the growth rate in the population looks like or ought to be. So the same idea, and with a prime on top of it is a growth rate in the current period or the future growth rates minus the past, all divided by the past will give you the growth rate. So small n here represent the growth rates in population. Now, if you want to break this equation one step further, this is basically n prime over n minus 1 equals n. When you try moving this minus 1 to this side of the equation, then you have a very nice equation to work with. That is to say, your future population depends on your current population plus the growth rates that you expect to experience every year, which is the n. So for the Solow growth model, this is one of the most important equations that you'll be seeing.
Should it not be n prime divided by n?
Correct.
Because of, okay.
Yeah, sorry, correct, yeah. Because I moved this minus 1 here, I tried to break it down without, I forgot to bring the division by n. So thanks for the correction. Is that okay with everyone? Anson?
Yeah, but someone said, did he call for attendance call?
No, I didn't. Did I? No?
No, no, you didn't.
Yeah. So pay attention. So this is one thing I saw during the course of this week. So on Tuesday, I did mention that whenever you guys have any issue about your participation grade, send your inquiry directly to your TA. But this morning, I woke up with several emails, still with the same idea as to I have a problem with my participation grade and asking the same question again. We should try as much as possible to pay attention to what we announce in class so that things will be much smoother rather than having issues with it. So those who had issues with their participation grade, be it you weren't here when I announced it, or be it you didn't pay attention to what was announced, go back to your TA and talk to him about your participation grade. All the announcement that I do make, just make sure that you follow either on the announcement board, or if you don't have time, you can watch it during the at your own leisure time. You can watch the video and then you can see the announcement in there. So I didn't call for announcement for now. When the time is due for announcements, I'll let you guys know. Anson, is there any further question in there?
No, I think there's a question, but it was answered.
Okay. So we have this guy here, and thanks for correcting me on the division by n. Now, the next thing we need to look at here is consumption. What defines consumption? So remember, in the Malthusian model, we did mention that whatever you produce is whatever you consume. So Y equals C. This is not the case in the Solow growth model. We have a different idea as to what consumption is. So you might produce Y, but you save a portion of it, which is a savings rate. So whenever you see small is a savings rate, small s. So 1 minus what you save goes to your math. So this is your consumption rate. C equals Y minus small s multiplied by the big Y. In terms of defining what savings is, you tend to see that I did indicate that this is the same as Y. But before we go ahead, let's quickly look at it from this perspective. So what you invest is basically what you save. So your savings is the same as your investment. And your savings, remember, is the same as your investment, which basically implies that S multiplied by your big proportion of what you produce, Y, is your savings, which is your big S, which is the same as your investment, given this identity. So this is an important equation to keep in mind. C equals 1 minus small s multiplied by big Y. Investment is the same as savings, which is the same as small s multiplied by big Y. At the end of the day, you end up with this equation where C equals Y minus I. And this is the same as the income expenditure identity we saw in the Malthusian. This equation is the same as Y equals C plus I. So this is...
Sorry.
Yes, please.
So there's a question. So do we have extra assumptions for this model, like closed economy or no government or income expenditure identity?
Yeah, that's a good question. The very first one I would like to point out is there's no government as of now, so there wouldn't be taxes. So when there's an introduction of government, I think that might be chapter 9, where government comes in, we'll make that assumption. But for now, there's no government. So you wouldn't see G, just like what we saw in the Malthusian, right? You wouldn't also see net export, just to make things much easier for us. So that is more or less like not trading with the rest of the world, so you have a closed economy. So NX is 0. What you see here is the I, which more or less indicates our ability to save. So if in 1800 or before 1800, we didn't have any refrigerator to save our apples, in 1990, we now have a refrigerator to save our food. So there is this I that we have each and every period. We can save portion of what we have, right? So that would be the major difference here. Still no government, still closed, but we can have this. Yeah. So this is basically it. So if you understand these basic equations, then we can go ahead and start working with the more complicated ones. So let me quickly write the transition to capital, how your capital transition over time, and let's see how best we can make sense of it. Is there a question in there, Anson?
Nope, no questions.
So remember, we've now introduced capital in this model, which is K. Capital. Imagine you have a laptop or you have a tractor that helps you produce something. So let's call that tractor K. We assume that the amount of tractors that you have for tomorrow, or the amount of computers that you have for tomorrow, is the same as the amount of computers that you have for today, which is K. But the question here is the value of your computer today the same as the value of your computer tomorrow? And the answer there is no, because over time, the value of your equipment tends to depreciate. The efficiency goes down, their market value goes down as well. So 1 minus D, where D represents the proportion of it that depreciates. So the amount of capital you have for tomorrow is the same as the amount of capital that you have for today, but you have to take into account the fact that it will have to depreciate or lose value along the way. So that's what the D here represents, depreciation rates. In addition to that, if you happen to be a wise person and you always think about your future investment, you think about buying new laptops for tomorrow as well. So you have to invest in buying new laptops each and every period in time. So that is I. So this equation here is an equation for the motion of capital, how your capital moves every period. So your capital for tomorrow depends on the capital that you have for today, taking into account the depreciation plus the new investment that you've done in acquiring new capital. So this is going to be an important equation. It will help us, define almost all the equations that we need henceforth. Is this okay with everyone? If you have questions with it, let me know. Is there a question in there, Anson?
Nope, no questions.
Good. So I have this guy here. Now let's revisit what we had earlier. Remember, we pointed out the fact that I is the same as savings, this big S, and big S is the same as small s multiplied by y. This is what we saw earlier. Is that okay with everyone? Investment is the same as savings, and savings is the same as s multiplied by big Y. So this equation, which is the equation of law of motion of capital, is the same as K prime equals 1 minus D big K plus small s multiplied by big Y. But the good news here is, remember what Y is, right? Y is our output, and we have a function that helps us produce our output, which is basically f k by n multiplied by z. That's how we produce our output. So this equation now becomes k prime equals 1 minus d big K plus s z f k n. Is that okay with everyone? If you have questions, let me know. Now, just like what we started with, remember, we are always interested in getting everything in per capita. So instead of having big Y, we are interested in having small y. Instead of having big K, we are interested in having small k. So this equation, as we see here, happens to be in bigger, in aggregate. And we need to move them from aggregate to smaller values. So what I'll do here is I will divide this guy by n. So I have this guy to be small k. I have this guy by n. So I have this guy to be small f. This guy. This is where the problem will be coming from. And you have to stop me and ask questions. This is where the problem will be coming from. If I divide this guy by n and this guy by n, then I need to divide this side by n as well. But the question here is when I divide big K prime by n, it is not the same as small k prime. Right? It is not the same as small k prime. Because small k prime is big K prime divided by small big N prime. But if you just divide big K prime by big N without a prime, then they wouldn't be the same. Is that okay with everyone? Anson, is there a question in there?
I don't see any questions for now.
Good. So this equation is easy to work with. On this side of the equation, we have a match in T2 equation, which is 1 minus d small k plus either s, z, small f of k. But this part of the equation, we still have issues. We need to find a way of working around it. So I'm going to cancel this guy and show you guys how to transition this guy to big small k prime. So remember, k prime divided by n, where, as you guys pointed out to me, n equals 1 plus n. So if that's the case, I can shuffle this guy. I have n bar equals 1 plus n, right? Multiplied by n. Divided by 1 plus n, 1 plus n. So I have n standing on itself. The question here is, then I can nicely replace n with everything here. So I now have big K prime divided by n prime all over 1 plus n. Is that okay with everyone? Is that okay? Let me know if it's not. Anson, is it okay with everyone?
I guess so, because I don't see any questions.
Okay, good. So this guy has now turned into a much more simpler thing to work with. So I'm going to clean this guy and replace him with this. So it's going to be n bar over 1 plus n. So it's now much easier for us to work with. This divided by this will give us small k prime all over 1 plus n. Is that okay with everyone? So this now becomes a law of motion of capital that you see in the textbook. So I'm going to pause here. If you have questions, let me know. If not, then I can go ahead and work it out. Okay, so no questions. We are done with this equation. Let's quickly use it to gain 1 or 2 intuitions for us to work with. So I'm going to clean this guy. We now have the law of motion of capital in terms of smaller aggregate. So let's see how that works. I'm going to write this equation back up here. This is the same as 1 plus n small k equals 1 minus d small k plus s z small f of k. So after getting this law of motion of capital, one important thing we need to understand here is how will it look like in steady state? So we have to quickly go to steady state and see how this guy works. So steady state. In steady state, we assume that the capital that you have for tomorrow is the same as the capital that you have for today, which is the same as K star. Steady state basically means that nothing changes. We are in a state where the amount of capital still remains the same and nothing changes. So if you happen to be in the room now, write your full name and write present attached to it. Write your full name and write present attached to it.
Is that a lowercase k in the steady state equation?
You said? Oh, sorry, I didn't hear that.
Is it lowercase k?
Yeah, it's lowercase k because
okay.
we are trying as much as possible to put everything to per capital.
Okay, thank you.
So we have these guys here. We have k. So instead of writing this guy in this form, I can quickly come back here, write him as 1 plus n. Instead of k prime, I know k prime is the same as k is the same as k star. So this guy goes to k star equals 1 minus d k star plus s z f of k star. I can do a couple of things on one side of the equation and some on the other. So this is the same as, fine, let's leave this guy here, k star. Move everything here. I have 1 plus n k star minus 1 minus d k star. They have the same case, so I have n plus d k star equals s z f k star Yes. So there's a steady state equation that we have to keep an eye on. Now the question to class is, what does this guy here represent? Anyone to help me? What does it represent? S multiplied by these guys. Anyone? Anyone in Azali? It's going to be
investment.
Azali, yeah, it's going to be investment, right? Given the fact that this guy is the proportion of savings and this guy is the output. So this is investment. Right? This guy is more or less like capturing the fact that, so attendance has been taken already. If you come in and the attendance is done in more than a minute, please don't confuse the listing, right? I'd like to send a very neat list to your TA to make his work easier. If you're not here when the attendance was taken, and we are continuing with the discussion where people, type in questions, and you come back and write your attendance, and I'll be confused. I don't know when attendance was taken and which file to be sent to your TA. So please keep an eye on whenever I announce attendance, just type it and don't come in late and get it mixed up with questions. It gets a bit hard working with. So this is our investment. This is more or less like the rate of growth on the population plus the depreciation rate multiplied by our capital. So this is going to be an important equation, and we are going to graph it right away. So one thing I would like you guys to ask me right now is, do you have questions with how we derive it? Is there any
Sorry, there's a question. So can you explain why population growth will depreciate capital?
Why population growth rate will depreciate capital?
Yeah, that's the question.
We don't see it as such, right? We don't see it as population rate depreciating capital because depreciation rate is exogenous, right? Depreciation rate is exogenous. So if I would like to think about your question in the more, intuitive way, I think what you are trying to, yeah? You want to come back to it?
So Alex said, but it shows on the left side, and Joan said, I think it means that the amount of per capita capital decreases with population growth and depreciation.
Exactly. It means, yeah, so we have this guy here that you can clearly see where the, how do you call it? Where depreciation gets multiplied by the per capita output. So you tend to see that this is depreciation. But this here, the rate of growth means how do we catch up with it, right? So for every investment that we do in capital, or for every increase in population that we have to go in line with an amount of capital. So there's this level of compensation between the two. So remember, you have your production function looking this way, K and N. So for every investment that we have in capital, it should be compensated by a certain level of growth in terms of our population. So if I have 10 tractors and I have only one person in the population, how is the compensation between the two? It's going to be very, very minimal. So as the tractors increase, which means as K increases, the population will have to match it in that respect. You can look at it in the opposite direction. If I live in an economy where I have 1,000, we have 1,000 people, which represents more or less like the growth rate in the number of people. And the number of capital that we have happens to be extremely small. How do the two match? So for every K that we have, it should be matched by the N. And that's being captured by this K with the N and K star. I don't know whether I'm making sense. Your question, I get it from this perspective, but you have to understand N multiplied by K star as in the level of compensation between how much capital investment we have to compensate for the population growth that we already have. Is that okay? If it's not okay, let me know. Maybe I might have another way of looking at it.
Yep, it's good. Thank you.
Okay then. So we are done with these two sides of the equation. Now we are going to graph them. This is a function of K star. This is a function of K star. I'm going to graph them right away. So we have this guy here. This is a function of K star. And coming back to Alex's question, on one side of the equation, we had N, which is the population rate, plus D, which is the depreciation rate, multiplied by K star. Is a function of K star. So I'm going to put it somewhere here, where N plus D as a function of K star. But this guy is fixed. The number of people we have, the rate of growth is fixed, and the depreciation rate is equally fixed as well, right? So if you want to draw this, it's just going to be a straight line, depending on what the variables of N and D happens to be. Not necessarily 45, no. It depends on the values of N and D. So this is going to be my N plus my D multiplied by my K. So that's what you see, I believe, on page, yeah, that's what you see on page 183. Now, the next thing we need to look at is the fact that we produce, in terms of the investment is the same as S, F, Z, F, and K star. And as we realize that the production function is always going to be concave, right? The more capital you have, the more outputs you have. But the rate of growth in the output is going to keep on decreasing. So this guy here, which is the function we have here, is also going to keep on decreasing. So this is my investment, S, Z, F, and K. So at the end of the day, we have, at the point where the two of them meet, remember the point where this guy equals S, Z, F of K star gave us a steady state. That was a steady state. So whenever these two lines meet, the point where they meet represents our steady state capital. So this is going to be our steady state capital. Is that okay with everyone? Is that okay with everyone?
Yep, I don't think any questions.
Okay. Now, what I would like you guys to see here is what happens to this guy when the value of K is somewhere here. So let's take this guy to be K2. And let's take, let me get my green marker. Where's my marker? Can't find it. Let me just use this guy. And let's take this guy to be K1. Let's see what happens if you happen to be here, where your K1 is less than the potential steady state value. What happens to your level of K? So the prediction from this Solow model is that whenever your capital is below your steady state capital, this guy is going to gradually transition to the steady state. The second prediction is that when your capital is lower than the steady state capital, then this guy is gradually going to transition back to the steady state capital. To see this, you can see it in both ways. You can see it in terms of the diagram, or you can see it in terms of the equation. So let's have a look at it in terms of the diagram first. In terms of the diagram, the investment here, the investment in capital is going to be lower than the depreciation rate of the capital. So for every $10 that you put into a capital investment, you only get 9 back because the depreciation rate is higher than the return in terms of the investment. So if you keep on doing that, the more capital you add in, the lesser return that you are having. So gradually you tend to see that there's going to be a reduction back to the steady state. The opposite is going to be the case. Here, the return on investment is higher than the depreciation rate and the population growth rate. So for every investment that you do, you're going to have a higher return, and you keep on increasing to the point where you reach your steady state.
Look at George's version.
Yeah. Questions? Questions? Is it okay from the graph? I would like to go to the equation. Is it okay from the graph perspective? Anson?
Yeah, I think that was just some random noise.
Okay. So if you have your mic on, please just shut it off. Only Anson should have his mic on so that we can all get to listen to what's happening. So this is basically what we have, the transition in between both periods. Now, to see this in terms of the capital equation that we saw, let's have a look at it from this perspective. Remember, we had K prime divided by, or K prime equals Z FK minus, what was it? Plus 1 minus dk. There's going to be 1 multiplied by n, right? Was that the case? 1 plus n, because 1 multiplied by n here, 1 plus n. So this tells us how much capital you should be having for tomorrow. With this production function, remember it happens to be concave, so it looks like this. There will be a point in time whenever you invest, the return on investment is going to be very, very small. So imagine,
sorry.
Yeah.
There's a question. So is that a big K or a small K?
Small k.
Small K. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, it's going to be small k. So I tend to slant it a bit. I write them in this way to represent the small k, and when you see this, it's a bigger k, right? So when you see it much more slanted, it's a smaller k. Is that okay?
Yep, thank you.
Sure. So let's have a look at this. So at the point in time where we are in the steady state, this k is the same as this k, so we are somewhere here. We have our line drawing towards this direction. Well, let me draw it in a much, refined way. So we have this guy here. We have this guy somewhere here. At this point in time, this is our K star.
Sorry, the pen is kind of unclear. Can you change the pen?
Okay. Is this okay from here?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So let's understand the dynamics. This is my production function. When I try to put in extremely high K2, let's see what happens here. Because this guy is concave, I'm somewhere here. So when I put in extra K2 here, my return here will increase, but it might increase by maybe 5. Because this guy, imagine this K2 is 10, I put in K2 to be 10 here. Because of concavity, I get a return of 5. This 10 is just going to be the same 10 that I put here. And this guy is going to be a minus return. So this guy is increasing, but this guy is extremely higher. So the minus sign here is undoing the return that you have here. So this guy will gradually start coming down. Your future values of K star will start coming down. Is that okay with everyone? Is it confusing? Let me go back.
There's no questions for now.
Guys, do you guys have questions? Let me pause because it might be confusing. Imagine I put in K to be 10. When I put in K to be 10 here, because of diminishing returns, I might get a return, but not as high as I put in. Whilst this guy is already 10, because of negative sign here, this return will undo this return, and I have a reduction in the capital for the future. So gradually, this guy will start coming back to the steady state. So keep on reducing back to the steady state. If, for instance, I have K1 to be maybe 2 here, because of increasing returns, when I'm to put K1.
Sorry, there's a question. Yeah. So because ABS value of 10 bracket minus D bracket is bigger than the first term, small k is decreasing period over period?
Yeah, it's going to be small k prime. Small k prime will be decreasing period over period. And it will come back to k star. Was that a question?
So next period, small k will be lower than current period k until k equals k prime? Or k star, sorry.
Yeah, until k equals k star, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And because, so the other example here is when k equals 2, which is lesser than the steady state value. Because of increasing returns, when I put 2 here, I might get a high return of maybe 4. While this guy is already at 2, because that's the original value I put here. So the return here is higher than the depreciation I tend to experience here. So the next period value is going to keep on increasing till the point where I reach the steady state value. Is that okay with everyone? All good?
Yeah, I don't see any questions.
Okay, so if there are no questions, then this is the transition period. Just try as much as possible to understand why we move towards K star whenever we are above the steady state or below the steady state. It might be an interesting question that you might want to keep an eye on. So let's quickly, so if you're done with the transition, getting to understand how they look like in terms of the steady state, then we can now go back to what Malthusian predicted, and let's see whether he makes sense or not. So I'm going to do a couple of stuffs here under the comparative stats for the Solow growth model. So just to repeat it, we have this guy here, we have the K values here, we have this to be the investment, we have this to be the Z, we have this to be the F, we have this to be the K, F of K. We have these guys here. This is N plus D multiplied by K. And this is our steady state value. One thing we can decide to do here, so let me ask this question. What happens to this graph, this line, when this S goes away? When I set it to 1. What happens to the concave line when I set the S to 1? Anyone to help me? So we now have S, Z, F, K. What happens to this equation when I set this guy to
1? Does investment equals to output?
Yeah, exactly. So we just have output, right? And will it go up or, yeah. Will this line go up or down?
Up.
So just keep an eye on that as we change this guy. So that's one thing I would like to ask the class, just to make sure we all understand. So this is the graph that we had. We have the investment to be concave. We have the depreciation rates given to us. Now,
sorry, we have a question. So is it because S equals proportion of consumption that you're saving?
Yeah, S is a proportion that you are saving. Yeah.
Thank you.
S is a that you're saving, yeah. And 1 minus S is the consumption. So the comparative stats I would like to do here is increasing the savings rate.
Sorry, so S equals 1 equals 100%. And Alex said proportion of income, I think. Not proportion of consumption, if I read it correctly.
Was that? Yeah, so can you read the question again?
I mean, Jean said, because S equals proportion of consumption that you're saving, so S equals 1 equals 100%. And then Alex responded that proportion of income, I think.
Yeah, the proportion of income. That's correct. Yeah, it's proportional. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, because we know that consumption equals 1 minus S rather. Right? So what we are going to do here is we just do a couple of comparative stats. Let's see what happens to this guy. So we have the K star here. Now what happens to this guy when we increase S to S2? What happens to this line? So what we all mentioned here was, as we increase our savings rate to S2, the line increases. So what I'm doing here is we are increasing the savings rate to S2. So as we increase our savings rate, this guy goes up, right? And as it goes up, what happens to the steady state value of capital? The steady state value of capital increases. Is that correct? To K2. Is that okay with everyone? Is that okay with everyone? Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. So we now have this K2. Now the question here is, remember, output is a function. Output equals Z as a function of F as a function of K star. Now the question here is, what happens to Y under this K2? What happens to Y? Anyone to help me? Answer, is there anyone answering there?
It goes up, increases.
Exactly, it goes up, right? Because K has increased, right? To K2. And what is Y in the first place? What is Y in the first place? What does it represent? Anyone to help us? What does Y represent? What does what? Yeah, per capita state. Yeah, but I need one word that, one word that is consistent with what we saw in the Malthusian. All the answers are correct, but one word that is consistent with the term that we use in the Malthusian. Exactly, standard of living, right? Y represents the standard of living. So as K increases, the standard of living increases. Now let's back up. What did we do to increase the standard of living? We just had to increase our savings, and by increasing our savings, which means our investment is increasing, which will increase our capital, we tend to see that the standard of living is increasing. So this is one sharp contrast to what we saw in the Malthusian, where we didn't have any increase in the standard of living. Here we have an increase in the standard of living. Is that okay with everyone? Just by increasing our savings.
Yeah,
right?
I don't see any questions. Thank you.
Good. Now, the next thing I would like to point out here is the rate of growth of this output wouldn't change. It will come back to normal. So try and read on that. The rate of growth of the output wouldn't change. It will just be at the normal rate. Now let's see another comparative stat. So this is the first comparative stat. I would like everyone to keep an eye on that, and let's see what happens to the next comparative stat. Let's see whether that might be consistent with what Malthusian pointed out. Let's assume that the population growth rate has increased. Let's assume that the population growth rate has increased. If the population growth rate has increased, this line is going to shift, and it's going to shift towards this direction because there's an increase in N to N2. We now have N2 plus D. With this, what do we see capital? We see capital to reduce from the initial steady state back to this side. And as capital reduces, Y, which is a function of capital, As capital reduces, we tend to see that output also reduces. So in a way, increase in population growth rate will reduce the output per capita. What about reduction? That's one thing you would like to also see, right? Is that okay with everyone? Is that okay with everyone?
Yep.
Okay. Now, the final thing I would like to point out here is that we saw two important variables. We saw N and S. And we saw how these guys tend to affect our standard of living. Question: can we have a savings rate that is 120%? Is it possible to? No. Can we have a population growth that is negative, or put in another way, that is -1? That everybody is dying, and we reach a limit where there is nobody. Is it possible to keep on dying again when there is no one in the population? Obviously no, right? So there's a limit as to how much we save, and there's a limit as to what the values of our population growth rate needs to be. So in terms of our capital, these guys are extremely limited. When I want to move to a specific point in time and my S cannot allow me, then I can't go there. But one thing that we realize that doesn't have a limit is Z. Efficiency. Efficiency doesn't have a limit at all. Regardless of how we have an improvement in technology, we will for sure have increase in technology so far as we keep on investing and thinking about new ways of doing things. Z will forever keep on increasing. And because it can forever keep on increasing, our output can forever keep on increasing when we deal with only Z. However, in terms of the savings rate and in terms of our population growth, these variables are limited. And they will have a limit as to where it can give us in terms of our output, beyond which we cannot get any improvement anymore. So the growth rate is going to be constant in that sense. But in terms of our efficiency, we don't have any limit. So that's one thing I would like you guys to pay attention to. Is there anyone with any question in there?
No, not as of now. Thank you.
Okay. So that will be the final part of, I think, the book. And what I would like you guys to also pay attention is on the golden rule. So read on the golden rule and get back to me if you have questions on it. If we have time on Tuesday, I'll go through the golden rule and finish the Solow model proper in terms of comparing the parameters, just like what we saw today. And we can start with the endogenous growth, which is chapter 8. So let me know if you still have questions. If not, then hopefully I'll see you guys next week and I'll get it graded as well. And to the 3 students who weren't able to write the first midterm, I got back to you. Send me an email just after today's class and I'll set a time for you to retake that question. Okay, see you guys, bye. Thank you very much, Anson.
No problem.
Okay.
Thank you.